This is a test so that the people who are Zooming with us this morning know that their sound is working. So we're just a little ahead of our 1 minute to go, but we want to make sure it's working. If I can get a text message from Andrea or Martha to tell me that they've got sound, that would be good. I'm going to keep talking because I'm not sure they can hear it yet because of the delay, right? Sorry, guys. We didn't build this into the program, but it's an exercise in not letting any of those sheep be out there by themselves. I can come up with them. Okay, I'm just making sure they're connected. Can you hear us now? Got it. They're hearing us. Awesome. Good morning. I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. Seems so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change.
Well, there's a hurting in my family. There is sorrow in my town. There is panic all across the nation, and there is wailing the whole world round.
But I am open and I am to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. May the children see more clearly. Be more wise. May the winds of change caress us, even though it burns our eyes. For I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. Give me a mighty hope to hold my confusion.
Give me a desert to hold my fears.
Give me a sunset to hold my wonder.
Give me an ocean to hold my tears. For I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Pax Christi. And thank you for answering the invitation to spend this beautiful Saturday morning. And if you can't see the beauty in the rain, see it in what's here. Together to engage in a conversation about race, to unpack what it means to us as individuals and collectively as a faith community. As Pax Christi, we are committed to 6 core values in everything that we do. As we move through our time together today, we will hold up each of these values. So, as a community of faith, we are God-centered. We hold God at the center of our daily lives and provide a place for spiritual rest and rejuvenation. And so, we begin in prayer.
Wherever 2 or 3 or more of us gather, there too Christ will be, present in our midst. Like the disciples who have walked ahead of us, we gather this morning around our Paschal candle, a living flame, aware of Christ's presence. We have each been called to this conversation, invited to this encounter with racism, to make space for new ways of listening, seeing, and being together. We are humans made for community. And in this community, we find the possibility of knowing our true purpose, our true call. We are created children of God, connected inextricably with God's creation. We are people of faith, called to be agents of transformation. We are salt, we are leaven, and we are also light.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." He called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he replied. Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Let us pray. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, and we have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. We pray in faith. Amen. So now that we've centered ourselves on prayer, and before we move into the content of this retreat, we'd like to acknowledge that the 4 facilitators for this retreat are all white. As facilitators, it is not our place to speak for anyone else's experience, but rather to invite all into sharing from your own experience and deep listening of others' experiences.
Hello, my name is Mary Lanners, and I am the chair of the Justice Council here at Pax Christi. Thank you for being here and also on live stream, willing to share, to learn, and be part of this retreat. Throughout our time together today, we will invite you all to listen, to write in the space provided in your program, and to share in small groups. Before we get further into our time together this morning, we invite you to take just a few moments to open to page 5 of your program and write your answer to this question in the space provided. What brought you here today? Okay, thanks for taking that time to write down your own personal reason for being in this conversation today. The collective reason that we have called this retreat is rooted in another of our core values. As a community of faith, we are committed to justice. We advocate for the marginalized and act as catalysts for systemic change. How can we act for systemic change if we don't see what's built into the system? When George Floyd was murdered in downtown Minneapolis, I was shocked, and like everyone else, I wanted to do something. I wanted to be part of something, advocate, and to be around people who had the same beliefs I did. I joined the Justice Council here at Pax Christi, and I participated in 3 Just Faith programs that focus on racial equity, systemic racism, and racial healing. The small group experience of the Just Faith racial justice programs provided a safe and welcoming space to pray, to read, to learn, to discuss, and to discern our path forward with regard to racial justice. This event today was an answer to an extended conversation that happened in more than one of these small groups. Before doing these 3 programs, I was very unaware of what I didn't know about the country I grew up in and the Black and Indigenous community I knew nothing about. Through readings, prayer, small groups, I have learned about what my faith has shown me about injustice and that I am not alone in these feelings. I want to say my eyes were opened to the Black community's history and pain that they have and still experience. I learned about what happened in the Rondo neighborhood, tearing the community down to make room for Highway 94, redlining, the killing of Philando Castile and George Floyd. Let's say it made me very aware of what I didn't know and what I could do to change that. About violence against Black men. Father Brian Massengale, activist and professor of social ethics at Fordham University, said, "There have been hundreds of these events. Each time we get there, we are met with incomprehension. People say, he must have done something wrong." The killing of George Floyd was a real wake-up call. He did not deserve being killed. There is something profoundly broken here. We, as Catholics, need to do a deep personal examination. Ask ourselves, where in my life have I been willing to tolerate racial exclusion? Where have I noticed something being obviously wrong and not spoken up? I have lived a very safe white experience living in a small town in Wisconsin. I went to Catholic schools all through my education, of grade school, high school, and college. My family did not talk about racism. It just wasn't a topic we talked about. I still remember going to Milwaukee to go shopping. My father locked the car doors when we went past the Black neighborhoods while we were on the freeway. I felt like Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. What was it that he was locking our doors against? What was I missing? It was something we just didn't talk about. When I look back at my younger years and the privileges I have had, it does make me think of white privilege. All the advantages I have had because I am white. I am aware of my whiteness, but would like to start sharing what we as a community can achieve by working together and talking about our biases and dreams to change. This retreat is just the first step. In this retreat, we are entering into a sacred conversation with one another. As a community of faith, we are committed to inclusion. We build relationships and create an inclusive culture through our attitudes, actions, and activities. In order to honor this value of inclusion, we honor everyone's sacred story by naming our experience. The gospel we heard in our opening prayer teaches us about what we don't see, the realities and the people so often overlooked. We can't see what we don't see. That is, what we overlook, disregard, or never seem to notice. Remember, we are called into this conversation today to discover new ways of listening, of seeing, and being together. How do I bring this gospel into my daily reality? As we prepare to reflect and share our stories with one another, please turn to page 6 in your program and review our guidelines for sharing. Now I invite you each to turn to page 8 and take 5 minutes to write about the following question. When were your eyes first opened to race? Okay, thank you for writing. Now we invite you to move into a group of 3 to share from what you wrote. Please use the guidelines as before, and be sure that everyone has a chance to share their story. Thank you.
There's a hurting in my family. There is sorrow in my town. There is panic all across the nation. And there is waiting the whole world round. But I am open and I am willing for to be hopeless. What seems so strange, it dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change.
So that transition didn't go very well, did it? We're calling you back. We're waiting for a few groups on Zoom to get off. So good morning, I'm Bruce Kane, and I'm a member of the Pax Christi Racial Equity Committee. And I'm going to lead you in a discussion about the next concept. Remember, we are called into this conversation today to discover new ways of listening, of seeing, and of being together. I invite you all to watch the following video defining and discussing the characteristics of implicit bias.
Implicit bias. We unconsciously hold attitudes towards others or associate stereotypes without consciously realizing that we do so. Implicit bias, which is also called unconscious bias or implicit social cognition, deep-seated within the brain, below the conscious level. Studies have demonstrated implicit bias against racial groups, genders, LGBTQ, and other marginalized groups. We may even be prejudiced against our own group, although we tend to favor our in-group with positive stereotypes and disfavor out-groups with negative stereotypes.
The immediate feeling you get or the immediate thoughts you have about a person, an assumption you feel, just anything you feel really stems somewhere from an experience you've had or your upbringing.
It depends on the region you're from, the country you're from, the background you grew up in. That shapes the person's unconscious bias.
I think sometimes you don't even realize it, but your own actions, maybe the way you treat others as opposed to treating others that look like you or that act like you or that are your friends.
Implicit bias often runs counter to people's conscious, expressed beliefs. Few physicians espouse racially discriminatory views, and yet doctors tend to recommend less pain medication for black patients than for white patients with the identical injury. In other words, people can be explicitly unbiased, yet implicitly biased, according to psychologist Daniel Kelly and colleagues.
One of my closest friends since high school, we've worked on a lot of projects together, we've been in a lot of classes together. Sometimes we'd be working together in a group project, for example, and she would say stuff like, oh, you're good at math, you're good at science, here, you can take this part of the project or something. I don't hold it against her or anything, and she doesn't mean any harm by it, but obviously there's that implicit sort of bias or stereotype that Asians are better at math and science.
Implicit bias has been found in a large array of studies using various tests, but much of the evidence for the phenomenon comes from Harvard University's Project Implicit website, home of the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. Literally millions of people have visited this site and taken various tests that ask them to respond rapidly to questions that require them to associate blacks or whites, males or females, or young or old, etc., with positive or negative words.
Most of the implicit biases that I've run into are probably positive ones, things that come with being a white male and having height and having a good voice and things like that.
Professor Nosek and colleagues tested more than 700,000 subjects and found that more than 70% of white subjects more easily associated white faces with positive words and black faces with negative words, concluding that this was evidence of implicit racial bias. In fact, additional evidence indicates that measures of implicit bias better predict people's conduct than measures of explicit bias.
I think that if you are anyone, to be blunt, that it's not a white male, you potentially feel that implicit bias. Maybe you're just looking for someone that is like you because you like you, and so you want to be around more people like you. But what's really rooted under that is that you potentially don't think that someone else is as smart or as capable, and that is coming from a place of implicit bias.
Now here's some good news. Various scientists have criticized the IAT. They point out, for example, that individuals who take the test on different dates often score substantially differently. Even IAT supporters admit that implicit bias, at least as demonstrated by the test, is widespread but relatively minor and has only a small impact upon people's real-world actions. In other words, the results of the test are not strong enough to predict particular behaviors by individual people. However, let's not get too comfortable. Even if the IAT cannot predict the future conduct of any one individual on a given occasion, it still indicates how groups of people will act on average, and that is worrisome. For example, few people openly advocate for discrimination in hiring, but white applicants receive 50% more responses from potential employers than do black applicants with the same resume. Likewise, college professors are substantially more likely to answer student emails if the students' names indicate that they are probably white than if the names sound like they belong to black students. And in one study, online course instructors were 94% more likely to respond to discussion posts by white male students than by other students.
There are a lot of opportunities to promote people within the workplace. It doesn't happen because of different biases. People assume, a woman is of a certain age or they're married, and you think, oh, she's going to want to have kids, so we're not going to give her this really tough, big project.
When I graduated from West Point in 2009, I went to my first organization, the first unit assignment. I was the only Latino officer in a group of about 100 other officers. Yeah, I think there was a lot of hesitation in really following my lead as a leader for the organization. I think it hindered in some way the ability for us to build cohesive trust within our organization and really have that going into a combat environment.
Because implicit bias operates at a mostly unconscious level, it is difficult for individuals to overcome. No existing training regime has proven particularly effective at debiasing implicit bias. But, fortunately, some research shows that stereotypes can be unlearned and that safeguards can be put in place to minimize their impact. For example, women used to make up only a relatively small percentage of the musicians in orchestras. But when orchestras began holding blind auditions, where the applicants played behind a curtain and their genders were unknown to the judges, the percentage of women chosen to play in symphony orchestras doubled. Perhaps we can put a dent in implicit bias after all.
These biases are sometimes so deep-rooted within us or within our culture that we don't even realize that they are biases.
We could have a mutually, beneficial conversation and really benefit from learning from each other and really understand that we're all not that different.
Listen, really absorb the experiences of those around you, especially those who come from backgrounds that are unlike yours.
Learn something new about a person, and then that will kind of help shift that bias, because now you've actually asked that person, or now you get to know that person.
There's so many opportunities to engage with others, to say, I don't want to do this again. Can you help me not do that? And people are willing to have those conversations.
So my story is I grew up in a first-ring suburb of Milwaukee, a farm community quickly becoming a booming bedroom community. Everyone looked like me. In 1967, the race riots dominated the news of the city of Milwaukee. Most of our exposure to these events came to us via the local news on black and white television and by my dad's stories who worked for the local gas company, with the charge of turning off gas services to places destroyed in the riots or households not paying their gas bills. The stories magnified the events we saw on TV. Most of the riot participants didn't look anything like me. In the fall of 1970, I began my high school career in downtown Catholic school. Most of the students came from affluent suburbs, yet there was an endowment that afforded students without the family means to be a part of the class. Most of the kids receiving the endowment funding were kids of color, which made up 10 to 20% of the total student body population. I developed a relationship with a fellow student named Clyde, my first lived experience of having a relationship with a person of color. We visited each other's homes and families to solidify the friendship, and beyond the obvious difference, we uncovered inherent differences, mostly in environment. Urban versus suburban, bigger versus smaller house, driveway versus alley. For the first 2 years, to get home, I rode the city bus to the end of the line where my mom picked me up. The bus line went through a pretty tough neighborhood and a public high school serving the neighborhood's residents. One afternoon, the city bus pulled up to the high school when 4 black kids got on. They immediately came to the back of the bus and sat on all sides of me. I had on a high school jacket that would have identified where I was coming from, and I was bullied pretty good. There was one of me, 4 of them. Most of the other occupants on the bus moved up front, like there was an unsaid rule about who rides where. I wasn't aware of the rule or willing to give up the seat and let them win. Instead, I wrote it out. I did figure out that future rides alone past the high school meant sitting the closest seat to the bus driver, and sure enough, the bullying never repeated itself. Getting back to my relationship with Clyde, it ended up deteriorating throughout the first 2 years of high school. My lunch times with Clyde ended as he took to sitting at a table occupied by other black kids. It was clear that our friendship succumbed to the pressures of divided races. 40 to 45 years later, good old Allison Bovair asked us in our Just Faith class the same question we asked you in the last session. What was the first memorable event where you encountered race? And of course, my bus ride story surfaced. I thought I had a good reason for not being in relation with people of color. I never retold the story before, but it still had its grasp on me 45 years later. I still could not forgive those kids for what they did. And worse than that, to some extent, I couldn't forgive the whole black community. I still ask the question, was my high school friendship with Clyde a victim of implicit bias? Explicitly, over the past 35 years, I've worked with nonprofits delivering services to mostly communities of color. I am proud of the accomplishments and how much the organizations have done. This past February, I was in a Housing Services Committee meeting on Zoom. I had the Hollywood Squares screen on, and our membership is mostly made up of people of color. While we were on the call, the sentence of Officer Potter was revealed for the killing of Dante Wright. I was shocked by the reaction of the attendees and remained speechless as my fellow committee members shared the litany of wrongdoings with the trial and with people of color interacting with police. I felt like I was in a different world and couldn't muster up the same feelings. My relationships with the folks that I worked with to do our work was seemingly not strong enough for me to understand their feelings. Was that, too, a result of my implicit bias? There are an estimated 11 million bits of information at any moment in time that we individually can see, hear, taste, and feel, of which our brain is capable of consciously processing only 70 things and remembering 11 of them, and that's if I'm lucky. Equally contributing, the human brain has a huge appetite to take on more and more of these bits of information. And that's a big and, it always seeks to be right. Subconsciously, your brain will attempt to align past experiences with current experiences. Seems like a pretty big arena for implicit bias to play. So, subconsciously, what happens when I have a negative life experience from the past, like my bullied bus experience, and see a news story involving young kids of color and poor light? Does my brain subconsciously stereotype all black youth? The good news about implicit bias is it's malleable. It can be unlearned. And this past Lent, I decided to work on my behavior of judging. It seems to me judgment is deeply rooted in biases, both explicitly and implicitly. So when I feel myself judging, I stop and think about the bias behind those judgments and how the bias was formed. Is my bias formed by relationships or stereotypes? And if it is formed out of stereotypes, I need to stop the judgment and work more on relationships. It is only in relationships that stereotypes wither and implicit bias loses its hold. Judgment seems the worst when we share it with others without checking our biases, but equally harmful is when we hold our judgments inside. I think of Mother Teresa's wisdom in her quote, "Man's greatest sin is not hatred, but indifference to one's brothers." I believe my unchecked implicit bias plays a big role in that indifference. So as a community of faith, we are committed to spiritual growth. We engage in a lifelong process of spiritual growth and continually learn how to live out our faith. Learning about what contributes to our unchecked biases and how we may become aware of them is practicing a discipline of spiritual growth. How does implicit bias influence my daily reality? So, turn to page 10 in your program and take 5 minutes to write about the following question. Write about a time when you found yourself judging someone or a group of people without having a relationship with him, her, or them. Could that judgment have been rooted in your own implicit bias? And you can, take 5 minutes and we'll come back. Thank you. Okay, thanks for writing. You might have figured out the routine by now, but so we invite you to move in groups of 3 to share what you've wrote. And if you want to change it up, change it up. Please use the guidelines for sharing that are in the program and be sure that everyone has time to share their story. You got 15 minutes. Thanks. Okay. We're doing better. Okay, I'm calling you back to send you away again. This time we're going to take a 15-minute break. So I think we're looking at 10:30. We're going to gather again together. So there's more bagels, coffee, and water in back. Get up, stretch, and we'll be back. Yep.
am open, I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change.
We're on the home stretch. As you settle back in for the next part of our morning, we want you to know that you will be receiving a feedback form in your email in the next day or two. We promise it will only take 3 to 5 minutes to complete. Your feedback is really important to us as we plan our next steps. Thank you in advance for doing that. We really appreciate it. Good morning again, everyone, and my name is Phyllis Olson, and I am also a member of the Pax Christi Racial Equity Committee. And I too want you to know how glad we are that you are here today. As a community of faith, we are committed to stewardship. We acknowledge our God-given gifts and put them into action as we pray, serve, and share. The value of stewardship is very alive in our time together this morning as we share our stories, our experiences, our thoughts and feelings. We give the precious gift of ourselves to God and to one another. Like Mary and Bruce, I have had the privilege of taking part in 2 Just Faith programs on race. These programs helped give me a more complete understanding of the history of our nation. And much to my surprise, and sometimes anger, included chapters that were sadly missing from the history I had been taught in my grade school, high school, and college history courses. However, there was a lot of history on race and racism made in front of my eyes when I was growing up. I saw it, but unfortunately, I had neither a context nor a community that helped me make much sense of it. At the age of 12, I remember seeing for what seemed like weeks, black and white pictures on TV of the black high school students in Little Rock who were trying to integrate a white school so that they could get a better education. They were confronted day after day by hostile white parents, police with guns and bully sticks, gnarling dogs, and angry shouts. My family and I watched in silent horror, but little was said, either at home or in school. There seemed to be a code of silence, and I too complied with the code, at least externally. Internally, I remember struggling to understand the horrific outrage and violence. I remember thinking that these students were just like me, except for the color of their skin. Okay, fast forward some 60 years, and I'm sitting in a racial equity retreat, the way each of the Just Faith programs begins. The intention of beginning with a retreat is to help participants build a sense of community and trust, and to use the lens of our faith to explore issues of racial equity, power, and privilege. During the retreat, one of the exercises was to reflect on and write a few words about the different stages in our lives that related to racism, who the important people in our lives were at these stages, and what significant experiences we had that were related to our sense of racism or racial justice. During that reflection, what I vividly remembered and wrote about were all of the emotions that I had when I was 12 years old. Feelings of wrongness, sadness, and powerlessness. Not everything I reflected on during that 8 weeks was as emotionally jarring as the experience I just described. Some of what we were reading and learning was new to me and to others. At times, I felt uncomfortable as I reflected on my beliefs and assumptions in the light of what I was learning. I can't begin to count how many times after watching a video, discussing a book chapter or an article, our collective voices exclaimed, "I didn't know that. I can't believe I never knew that before. Why didn't we ever learn this?" One concept was how those of us who are white are socialized not to see our own whiteness because whiteness is the norm, is normal. Whiteness is the water in which we swim, and we are unconsciously immersed in this water, the white culture. This is what then influences our ways of seeing and judging every aspect of our lives. Another concept is highlighted in the video we are about to see. The scientific methods and the hierarchical classifications of living things popular in the Enlightenment period were used to prove and reinforce that these different physical markers, such as brain size, were part of the natural order and a way to justify slavery and genocide. I can't believe I never knew this before. Why didn't I learn this before? Remember, we are called into this conversation today to discover new ways of listening, seeing, and of being together. As you watch the following video, I invite you to pay attention to any new information that you might be hearing.
Did you know that race was not always considered a biological or genetic category? So how did we come to understand it that way today? We all have a working definition of race. Whether you kinda understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it, hint hint, cough cough, that's me, it still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the US. But full disclosure, I do a lot of US history, so this is a US specific video about race, since these histories operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources: enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative, but many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies, and many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was an entirely different category of labor from indenture, because one, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. Two, slaves were not considered human. Three, it was not a contract because it takes two consenting humans to enter into a contract. And four, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms. So as a result of a desire to perpetuate systems of exploitation, more and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences amongst races, primarily the differences of black people from their white counterparts. This evolution of race became more concretized after social structures of slavery were in place, and not before, and was solidified by the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our third question. How did the Enlightenment impact definitions of race? The Enlightenment was a period of primarily European thought and ideological development that saw the emergence of some key concepts that tie back into today's discussion. First, there was a push in scientific communities to categorize the natural world using reason and creating elaborate hierarchical systems that emphasize the similarities between different species and subgroups and the inherent differences amongst others, and race was fitted into this same mold. As European theorists looked to classify the world into scientific groupings, physical markers that were already established social norms through enslavement and genocide were ways that they sought to prove that this was the natural order and not a social construction. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who was a proponent of concepts like individual liberty and freedom for white men, or those he considered his peers, also made claims that black slaves required less sleep than their European counterparts to justify excruciatingly long and inhumane work hours. And Samuel Cartwright, who falsely claimed that drapetomania was a mental defect that caused enslaved black people to run away from slavery, as if wanting to escape a lifetime of enslavement was illogical? The Enlightenment formulation of history also played a crucial role in the development of social ideologies of race. Kant, Hegel, and other philosophers of their day claimed that certain racial groups stood outside of history or had no history, and this included all groups that they considered non-white or outside of European ideals of modernity. This meant that groups that were devoid of history and culture were inherently less valuable and therefore subordinate to other races, and they were cast as the natural sacrifices of progress. These assumptions were also codified into law in the 18th and 19th century. The first naturalization laws of the United States in 1790 limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons and excluded other groups. Children born of enslaved mothers were said to inherit the legal statuses of their mother, effectively keeping them in bondage perpetually. And Native Americans were often denied legal property rights, which helped to expedite the process of westward expansion across the North American continent. And anti-miscegenation laws were drafted in order to assure that people from different racial backgrounds did not intermarry or have children in order to protect ideals of racial purity. But these racial categorizations didn't always neatly align with skin tone. In his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, historian Matthew Jacobson notes that in the US, white or Caucasian was not always considered a unified race composed of anyone of European descent. Whiteness was often considered exclusive to Anglo-Saxon descendants, while other European groups were broken into different ethnic categories such as Celt, Slavs, Iberics, and Hebrews, which were considered separate races from the 1840s to the early 20th century. But in the 1920s, when there was a stemming of immigration from Europe, these different races were subsumed into one category called whiteness to shore up a cultural majority against other racial groups and immigrants, and this persisted throughout the 20th century. So how does it all add up? Well, race started as a marker of kinship, but then we see it shift to become less about familial inheritance and more focused on physical indicators due to the rise of Enlightenment reasoning and labor exploitation. But where does that leave us to add to the evolution of race? And how has race been used in both positive and negative contexts throughout history? Definitely be sure to check out the works cited this week since there was a lot of material and ground to cover, and this was only just the surface. Well, that's it for this week. Drop them below, like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week. And what would happen if Islamic armies had won the
I think
battle?
you'll agree that was a really fast history. I invite you now to turn to page 12 in your program and take about 5 minutes to write about the following question. What surprised you in the video? Or what did you hear that you never heard before? Okay, thank you for taking time to write. So now we invite you to move into another group of 3 to share what you wrote. You can choose to exchange who you've been meeting with or continue with your same group. As before, just remember the guidelines that are in your program and just make sure everybody has a chance to speak.
everybody that's on is having a group together. Okay. Can you mute all? Yep. Okay. 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 So you're gonna just watch the screen and come back when we come back. Okay. And then do you think you'll be able to solve the Ginny 2 people thing? Can she go out and come back? Okay. Okay. All right. Bye.
I'll give you.
Give me a mighty oak to hold my confusion.
Give me a desert to hold my fears.
Give me a sunset to hold my wonder.
Give me an ocean to hold my tears. For I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change. Hello, everyone. My name is Joan Halpoulis, and I am the Director of Justice Ministries here at Pax Christi. We know that entering conversations that require openness and vulnerability in a culture that frequently feels discordant and fraught takes a bit of courage. Sharing in this way takes practice as we push through discomfort. And we thank you all so much for being open and willing to be here today. My story. In the summer of 2015, I was invited to attend a week-long leadership training for people across the United States working for social justice. I had been active in making phone calls and door knocking to help get anti-bullying legislation passed in the state of Minnesota the year before, and some of the leaders of that effort invited me to consider doing this training. So I said yes. And I found myself in a cohort of 20 that was made up of all genders, racial identities, ages, economic and educational backgrounds. The unifying qualification of all present was that we consciously placed ourselves in the hands of our teachers and of each other for the whole week to prepare ourselves for the work of justice. Well, as it turns out, the focus of this week-long training was entirely about systemic racism and how we have all been formed for playing our part in the system. Many of the concepts that Mary and Bruce and Phyllis talked about this morning were presented and wrestled with during that week, learning about whiteness and about embedded bias that exists in our economic and social systems through racialized policies, practices, and procedures was overwhelming at times. And I found myself uncharacteristically wanting to get really small in class. I found myself watching myself as I struggled to fully participate as the subject matter got harder to absorb. One of the skills that we learned during this training was a specific way to have a one-to-one conversation to build deeper relationships for the work. Justice work requires us to hold fast to the value of honoring the life and dignity of all people and the planet. And this is not a theoretical exercise. It's real life, and it takes practice. One-to-one conversations are meant to build deep and authentic relationships by not avoiding anything that might ordinarily be left unasked or unspoken. So on day 3 of the program, I had a chance to practice the art of the one-to-one conversation with a younger Black participant in my cohort named John. And at the very start of the conversation, he asked me, "So Joan, you're just getting started in this work, right?" I said, "Yes." And then he asked, "What took you so long?" I wasn't quite sure how to answer that without feeling like I was making a bunch of excuses for not really paying attention to all these things before. But his question was a valid one, an important one, and he took the risk to ask it to me point blank. That question was the key to my leaning in and making a commitment to keep learning and to keep building relationships, discovering my path to undoing racialized systems. That conversation was my access to beginning my journey with regard to racial justice. It helped me to begin to look for opportunities to be in deeper relationships with people of color, to learn about my own blind spots, and to recognize where racialized systems are at play. And I'd like to add that it helped me to be bold in making new relationships with people of color, even at the risk of having difficult conversations like the one I had with John. So, at this point in our time together today, many of you may be asking yourselves, now what? What good is knowing this stuff, acknowledging the real history of race in the USA, being present to our own collective and individual biases? As a community of faith, we are committed to lay leadership. We co-lead and share in the responsibility of upholding the mission of the church. Discerning what actions we might take as individuals and together and following through with them is an expression of our lay leadership. In her story today, Mary told us all that when she was called into the work of racial justice, she joined the Justice Council. In response, it was her expression of her lay leadership for Pax Christi. And by our very presence here today, we're affirming our role and responsibility in building up God's kingdom here on earth. Now, in our Just Faith journey together, during the part of the program that deals with the question of now what, we brainstormed together what actions we could see ourselves taking. Some of our ideas included being more consciously aware of the point of view of the media we listen to, view, or read. Having courageous conversations with family and friends about race and racism. Leading discussion groups in our Pax Christi community about race. And having a retreat for our community on race. We're pleased that some of these ideas are coming to fruition, including this retreat today. And there are so many ways that we can share in this work, hold ourselves accountable to keep moving and learning. We hope that this experience today may lead all of you to join us. On page 16 of your program, you will see a list of resources and opportunities for taking action. This is just the beginning of what is possible for us to do together. Remember, we are called into this conversation today to discover new ways of listening, of seeing, and of being together. So I invite you now to turn to page 14 of your program. Take 5 minutes to write about the following question. Now what? What am I being called to do at this time about racism? Okay. Thank you for taking the time to write some things down. How's everybody doing? Good. It's been really great to listen from a distance, the hum of these conversations today. Okay, so we're going to do one more share time with people around you. And what we want you to do is to move back into some groups again, and please use the guidelines for sharing as we have been doing all morning, and make sure that everybody gets a chance to share. So you're going to share from that question, now what? And you have 15 minutes. Hello, everybody. I'd invite everybody to come back from your sharing. We could do this all day, I think. Before we conclude today, I had intended to suggest something else in my last sharing. When I told everybody that Mary's expression of lay leadership was to join the Justice Council, I'd also just kind of like to put in a plug that we are in a discernment process right now at Pax Christi for lay leadership, and we would welcome anyone who would be interested in discerning about joining the Justice Council and the work of the Justice Council in the coming year. So just wanted to put that in before concluding today. So let's all sort of take a deep breath in and let it out. In a CPTV series called Unlearning, Breaking Bias, singer, actor, and social justice leader Holly Near, who is the singer of and composer of the song we've been singing all morning, she said the following in this interview. My world vision wouldn't be nirvana, but it would be enlarging the group of people who move in the world with a caring and a social consciousness of that which is around them, starting with themselves. When we ourselves are willing to change from the inside out, the very act of that has a ripple effect. It is in that growing that our whole world changes. We can all do something. It starts from believing that one has a meaningful contribution to make at any given moment. There's always a way to be active. And then, by the time we get to the big stuff, then we're ready for it.
We know that our conversation here today begins to build community for hope and justice. We plan to continue to engage each other in this community with a spirit of openness and willingness to talk about racism and find ways to move forward together.
With God's help and in community with one another, may we continue to build a more peaceful and equitable world.
We want to say thank you again for all of you engaging in this conversation today. And just a small reminder that you will receive a feedback form in your inbox in the next couple of days, and we would really appreciate your feedback so that we know how to make this better and we know what our next steps are. And just a reminder that there is a book in the back called 40 Days of Prayer that we would like to give you as a parting gift. And this might be one way to begin Now What? This is very motivating and a book we've used in Just Faith, so we hope you enjoy it. Thank you for coming.